I'm sorry, there is no better word for this. They blocked the Russian delegation headed by the ambassador, Mr. Andreev, and didn't let them lay down the wreaths at the military memorial graveyard and made it practically impossible. As we've already mentioned, the Polish side will be made aware of our protest. And I will make sure that this is not the only countermeasure. And we will consider it another sign, not just an unfriendly treatment, but of the disrespect towards 600,000 Soviet soldiers who lay down their lives trying to liberate Poland from German occupation, and of course, of not delivering on their obligations to prevent such incidents. We're happy to know that not everyone, even in Europe, forgot about our input or still have the memory of the historic victory, because it was our collective victory over the Brown Plague. As you remember, fascist movements all over Europe were gaining ground, and this became our collective fight. When side by side, Red Army soldiers were fighting with soldiers from the countries who, during the war, weren't against the Nazi, but during the Second World War, after a lot of internal processes or external circumstances, changed sides or were forced to change sides, started fighting fascists, trying to force them further and further away to the West. And a lot of foreign citizens weren't afraid to stand side by side with our compatriots and Russian diplomats in Rome and Paris and in other places. Took place in these commemorative events. They walked along the streets of European cities. And our events were also joined by foreigners in other countries, in Asia, in Africa, and Latin America, and even on the official level. In the commemorative events in Cuba, we're joined by the leader of Cuban Revolution, Raúl Castro, and the country's president, Miguel Díaz-Canel Bermúdez. And in Nicaragua's capital, current ministers, including the Minister of Foreign Affairs, joined the procession. And we appreciate the attention and participation of our friends. Overall, these actions took place in more than 70 countries in 5 continents. And in more than 80 countries, there have been commemorative events, including the ceremonies of laying down wreaths at the monuments for Soviet soldiers and looking after the graves of our soldiers. And the celebration of victory is going on. A number of events will take place this week. We will keep reporting about it on our social media and on our pages. We're happy to know that a lot of countries celebrated the Victory Day along with diplomats from CIS countries and CSTO countries, former republics of the Soviet Union who keep the memory alive of the Soviet soldiers and their heroic acts. At the UN platform, along with partners from CIS countries, they released the same project, Don't Forget the Victory, celebrated the Victory Day along with diplomats from CIS countries and CSTO countries, former republics of the Soviet Union who keep the memory alive of the Soviet soldiers and their heroic acts. At the UN platform, along with partners from CIS countries, they released the same project, Don't Forget the Victory, where they told about this victory in monuments and museums and expositions. And the main goal is to keep the memory alive, how our countries honor the heroic acts of our ancestors. At the CSTO platform, Azerbaijan, Armenia, Belarus, Bosnia-Herzegovina, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Russia, Serbia, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, and Uzbekistan celebrated the 78th anniversary of victory in Second World War. And the temporary representative of Russia in Geneva also held an event which was held in a close family circle. And we would also like to know that Russian diplomats make sure to attend every event on May 9th, send their greetings to our president, And we would like to note that it's not just about celebrating it every year. It's an everyday work. And we also report about it on our websites. We always treat this celebration with extra attention. We will do everything to keep the memory alive of this victory, to never forget how much it cost, and we will never forget.
Есть, к сожалению.
But unfortunately, there are challenges that we are facing even during this solemn day. On the eve of this holiday in Poland, there was a desecration of a monument. On the 5th of May, in the town of Klubshica, the Polish authorities staged another disgusting event of demolition of the Soviet monument erected in 1945 in honor of 676 Soviet soldiers who died fighting the Nazis to liberate the settlement. Everything happened in the flagrant tradition of the last years. This disgraceful event was broadcast live, and the head of the Institute of National Remembrance, Karol Nawrocki, who flaunted his fabrications about the Red Army soldiers, tried to prove that in 1945 those hadn't been the liberators who fought the invaders, but, as he said, evil fought against evil, some enslavers against others, unquote. Perhaps he just forgot to mention that some enslavers brought people to gas chambers, and they dismantled people into organs, because the soldiers of the Third Reich needed blood and organs, while, as he said, other enslavers did everything they could to put an end to what the first group of enslavers were doing, because that wasn't just about murders, it was about something that hadn't been witnessed before on the earth. So these false statements made by this pseudo scientists in Poland will be proven to be wrong, because people brought up based on this logic will come back to them and do the same to them. According to the revelations of Nawrocki, both groups of enslavers wanted to exterminate Poland and Central Europe. Excuse me, but there should be some logic behind those words. As for the first group, it's clear, they built concentration camps, they buried people alive, they shoot at them, that we can go on and on. But what did the Soviet army do? They just fought back the Nazi troops and brought them back to Berlin. Does it mean that something impeded them to put into practice this logic of extermination? Or just was it all absolutely contrary to what he said? Moreover, he said that it wasn't a monument that was destroyed, but a propaganda object depicting events that did not happen. I wonder how it can be if there were no events. Where would have the monument come from? Or do they believe that if they dismount the monument, they would erase the events? Towards the end of the action, the leadership of the Institute of Remembrance, National Memory, reported on the destruction of 28 Soviet monuments during the year. But aren't they wondering who rebuilt Warsaw? Those who tried to exterminate it, or those who didn't exist? At the head of the institute said they were not just exterminating the monuments, but they were fighting for the consciousness of the new generation of Poles I can even give a hint as to how they can, what they can call those whose consciousness they were fighting for. Thus, Polish authorities deliberately distort the history of World War II and to please the political conjuncture, a state of grateful memory to the Red Army soldiers, leave to descendants a feeling of hatred and thirst for revenge, stealing from Poles our joint victory over Nazism. And it's not the only example that I can provide. I'd also like to mention that these days we're celebrating, and every year we speak about another important historic event. I'm talking about the offensive operation in Prague and the liberation of Prague. From the 4th till the 11th of May, the Prague offensive operation took place. It is the last offensive operation of the Red Army in Europe. And I'm wondering if it didn't happen either, according to some people. I would just like to provide you with the main information. And after that, we need to come to conclusion whether it really happened or not. How can we restore national consciousness? How can we know what is true and what is not? That's why, and that's for this purpose that people wrote books and kept them in archives in order to have some reference points and to avoid this devastating way. This offensive operation really took place, and it was conducted by forces of the 1st, the 2nd, and the 4th Ukrainian fronts in order to destroy, finally, powerful German military group in Czechoslovakia. Do you remember the Polish leaders claiming that the Ukrainian front included only Ukrainians, and that's why, according to them, it was a good part of the Red Army, and it achieved exploits, but that's not true. In reality, France were given names based on geographical criteria, not national ones. On the 2nd of May, Berlin, the capital of fascist Germany, was taken by storm. I would like to reiterate that the purpose of the operation was to exterminate the fascist Germany group on the territory of Czechoslovakia. On May the 2nd, Berlin was taken, and on the night of May the 6th, rebellious citizens of Prague addressed on the radio to the Soviet command with a request for help. The Red Army had to change its combat schedule, and without finishing the regrouping of its forces, commander of the 1st Ukrainian Front, Marshal Ivan Konev, the one person whose monument is on the territory of Ukraine and bothers Russophobic people, gave the order to move in the morning of May the 6th. On May the 7th, the Red Army approached the slopes of the Ore Mountains. On May the 8th, the city of Olomouc, the heart of Moravia, was liberated, rescuing the resurgent citizens of Prague. To tank armies of the 1st Ukrainian Front on the night of May the 9th made a fast 80-kilometer dash to Prague, and in the morning they were joined by units of other fronts. With the support of local citizens, the Red Army cleared the city from Hitlerites, and on May the 10th, in the Czechoslovak capital, the Soviet tanks entered the 1st Czechoslovak Army Corps formed in the USSR, which consisted of volunteers of the country. On May the 11th, Hitlerites finally put down arms, and this day the Soviet armies met with advanced units of the American army occupying the west of the republic. The Great Patriotic War ended with victory. Fight for Czechoslovakia, cause for Soviet Union, lives of 140,000 soldiers. Medal for the liberation of Prague was awarded to 390,000 people. On many graves of Soviet soldiers in Olshansky Cemetery in Prague, there is a date, the 9th or the 10th of May. They died in the last fights with the enemy. But to say goodbye to this world. We have repeatedly spoken about the sacrilegious attacks of today's Czech vandals on Memorial Obelisk honoring fallen Red Army soldiers, about the desecration of the graves of Soviet soldiers. about the shameful manipulation of the authorities with the monument to Soviet Union Marshal Konev, who liberated Auschwitz, Terezin, and Prague. And all the manipulations with the monument are a shame in the history of the country. But on this commemorative day, we would like to remember other Czech people and to express our sincere gratitude to the citizens of the country who preserved the historical memory of the war despite the mainstream and look after the graves of Red Army soldiers and their own soldiers on the territory of the Czech Republic. And so don't subdue to the oppression of the local authorities. Here is another example. Actually, there are a lot of examples of the kind. Now I'd like to mention 3 Baltic states, Estonia, Lithuania, and Latvia, who prepared well to another anniversary of the victory. Only Latvia eradicated more than 120 monuments devoted to the Red Army, and it's all taken place according to the line of Baltic states aimed at glorifying the Nazi. A couple of dozens years ago, it was impossible even to believe so. Back then, people would say that it was all propaganda and nothing of the kind was planned, but then it all happened. Some monuments devoted to real heroes are demolished, while other monuments devoted to anti-heroes and criminals who were considered criminals by a real tribunal, not a fake one, the Nuremberg tribunal, are erected. I'm talking about these Nazi criminals. On this day, which is sacred for the overwhelming majority of the world, thousands of people in Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia laid wreaths on memorials devoted to Red Army, and even in places where this memorial had been demolished. In Latvia, dozens of compatriots were detained, and there are criminal cases instigated against some of them. And it's not surprising, since in Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, the power belongs to those who are ancestors of accomplices to the Nazi regime of Germany. That's not the only thing I would like to mention. On the 3rd of May in Lithuania, a law entered into force according to which the Russian citizens cannot submit applications to buy immobile property and to get a residence permit. And there is a detailed investigation in case they pose a threat to national security. So now we can see that everything represents a threat to the authorities of the country, the flowers, the graves, the people of our country. Even those people who want to come to the country without even being in opposition to the regime. Since the 3rd of March, the consular stop receiving applications, visa applications from Russian people, and according to the new laws of Lithuania, based on these new laws, our ministry recommends that our citizens assess all the risks before going to that country or passing through its territory. And you know, in order to enable this blasphemous things to happen, you need to maintain the atmosphere during the whole year. How can you do it? Through some dissemination of misinformation, threatening. There is an example. In the beginning of May, countries of Northern Europe broadcast the series called War in Shadow. And that was produced by TV channels of Denmark, Norway, Finland, and Sweden. Sweden channel SWT. As I said, it was a result of an impartial journalist investigation, but in reality, this was just disinformation, the purpose of which was discrediting the Russian diplomatic service. And on the basis of that, there was a plot which had been previously used to provoke fear of our country. I am talking about the so-called spy activities by Russian diplomats, sailors, and scientists. And I'm waiting for the moment when migrating birds going from north to south, from east to west, will be recognized spies in the countries of Northern Europe. I believe that it will be the next stage. I don't know if fish or migrating birds will be recognized as spies. Without any proofs or evidence, these statements are made. They don't need any facts because they can just film journalists, prepare a text for them, and make them blame certain people, not caring about the rest. And they don't show that it is Russia who has been striving for the conduct of an impartial investigation for 8 months. There has been a session of the UN Security Council, and Western countries blocked the decision on the conduct of an impartial international investigation under the auspices of the UN Secretary General. There was such an idea to let the UN Secretary General invite impartial experts and to create a work group in order to conduct this investigation and to make it transparent and reliable. But when it comes to practical work and real investigation, West blocks everything. But when it's about a movie where they can do everything that they want, then they are pleased to do so. I would like to remind you that for many months we have been insisting on making this investigation truly international. We want Russian authorities and Gazprom's experts to be involved, because these are people who understand what infrastructure, what equipment are in question, and because they have relevant data and information and they are ready to share it on the basis of reciprocity and according to the existing procedures. At the same time, the authorities of Germany, Denmark, Sweden, and other Western countries refuse this approach, and they want to cover for the executors of these terrorist attacks. Of course, it's not mentioned in the movie. Of course, it also covers the activity of the Russian Center for Science and Culture in Copenhagen. So they believe that this cultural center is responsible for everything. According to this journalist, it's just a thing to hide, to conceal the activities of Russian secret services. I'd like to remind you that the main task of this center is to make the population of Denmark to get acquainted with the Russian culture. This campaign doesn't stand for any criticism anymore. I believe that everything that regards our cultural centers are even more widespread than the myth regarding Russian submarines in places where there are no seas and even rivers. So there is no need to discuss this in details. We believe that there will be a lot of misinformation, a lot of fakes, and even if we go through this, we understand that it has been all initiated by secret services. They want to depict Russia as an enemy. They want to justify the actions of the criminal Kiev regime. And the most important thing is what I have just mentioned, is to cover for the executors and the perpetrators of the terrorist attacks on the pipeline Nord Stream 2. Thus, we're approaching to a point of non-return. The internal situation in Pakistan, we are closely following the situation in this country around the arrest on the 9th of May of Imran Khan, former prime minister and leader of the largest opposition party, Tehreek-e-Insaf, who is accused of corruption offenses, particularly worrying media reports of violent attacks by protesters on police and military targets. We call on all sides to resolve their differences peacefully. We hope that the mass protests in Pakistani cities will proceed without any major clashes and that the situation in the country will return to normal soon. According to the information available, Russian citizens of Pakistan have not applied to our embassy in Islamabad for help. At the same time, I would like to draw your attention to the fact that the website of our embassy and social media accounts indicate contact numbers in case of emergency.
Between the 16th and the 19th of March, the third forum of youth initiatives between Russia and Azerbaijan will take place in the city of Mingachevir. On the Russian side, the organizers are the forum of the forum are the Ministry of Science and Higher Education, the Federal Agency for Youth Affairs, the North Caucasus Federal University, and on the Azerbaijani side, these are the Ministry of Youth and Sports. It's quite symbolic that this format was launched as one of the first as part of the implementation of the Russian-Azerbaijani Declaration on Allied Cooperation. The program of the forum includes discussion platforms on youth policy in Russian and Azerbaijani regions and advancing career opportunities for young people. The two countries will discuss social projects, scientific cooperation, and entrepreneurship. Another historic date which remains, however, relevant. It's the 7th of May, and it's been 24 years since the attack against the Chinese embassy in Belgrade during the aggression in Yugoslavia. Back then, 3 people were killed, including journalists from Xinhua News Agency and Renmin Rebound newspaper. 20 others were injured. The US formally claimed target selection error. End of quote. NATO justified itself by saying that it allegedly intended to just think about it. They are trying to justify their actions by their alleged intention to hit the nearby Yugoslav Federal Directorate for Supply and Procurement, which was engaged in arms export and imports. Apparently, they were allowed to hit that agency. They claim that they had used outdated maps that did not show the embassy building, despite the fact that the Chinese diplomatic mission had been based in that part back in 1993. So they used maps that were over 6 years old. The news of the attacks on the Chinese embassy caused quite a shock. I myself remember the footage. It was so hard to believe. And I remember the reaction in the streets of Beijing and other Chinese citizens. There was outrage, there were demands for accountability, and the world community had already witnessed numerous crimes by NATO against the Serbs. The alliance was repeatedly accused of inaccuracy and barbarity in bombing the country, hitting civilian targets and sometimes even residential areas of Serbian citizens with increased frequency, a pattern that the world will see more and more often in the future during NATO aggressions in different parts of the world. The Chinese representative to the UN then called the attack on the Chinese diplomatic mission building a war crime and a barbarian act. Beijing found the explanation provided by Washington unconvincing. The Americans tried to pay off the attack by compensating the families of the dead and injured. The Chinese authorities and the Chinese people, however, remember Washington's attack on its diplomatic mission in Belgrade in 1999 and are not about to forget this savage crime. China's foreign ministry spokesman my colleague Wang Wenbin has recently said so on the occasion of yet another sad anniversary. The US is continuing to foment strife in the Asia-Pacific and undermine world stability. For our part, we would like to express solidarity with the assessments of our Chinese friends. The time has come to put an end to the process of replacing the legitimate mechanisms governing international relations with some kind of rules-based order, which is merely about cynical and immoral arbitrariness of the Golden Billion and the West, which was launched against the background of the Yugoslav crisis. Russia and China are in favor of a more just world order and welcome the increasing number of states that choose the path of free and sovereign development based on their identity and traditions. We will work together consistently in the interests of creating an equal and open system of security in the world. On the 25th of April, the website of our ministry published materials containing some facts of egregious crimes of the British Empire in the colonial and post-colonial period. The British Empire's expansion was geographically the most extensive of any other Western European states. It was built mainly around the postulate about the cultural and religious exceptionalism of the British, something they are very familiar with. The British captured rich countries and territories and then exploited them economically, geographically the most extensive of any other Western European states. It was built mainly around the postulate about the cultural and religious exceptionalism of the British, something they are very familiar with. The British captured rich countries and territories and then exploited them economically, siphoning off resources and using them as raw material sources and markets for their industrial goods. In order to keep other nations under its control, London did not hesitate to use the most sophisticated methods. The brutal cruelty of British colonists in the national liberation struggle in India is flabbergasting, or during the Boer War of 1899-1902, where even children were used as laborers. It never ceases to amaze. It's all about interconnected events and things. When I hear Baltic self-styled experts who live off American grants or simply walk on the tight leash of blackmail, when they speak about those camps organized by fascists in the Baltic states, when they say that nothing bad happened there. From their point of view, from the point of view of modern politicians and experts in Baltic regimes, those were, imagine that, labor camps. And when you ask whether they have heard of what was happening to children in those camps, and they say, yes, everyone knows, children were re-educated there. I'm not sure whether blood transfusions and medical experimentation as well as organ harvesting can be qualified as re-education. No, one cannot. It's about extermination. You really ought to call a spade a spade. Given the influence of historic Britain over the Baltic states, you can see where the wind is blowing from, and these experiments over children in concentration camps, those are the inventions of the British Empire. The colonial machine of Britain literally milled millions of Africans, radically changing the continent's demographics. We can reasonably speak of British responsibility for genocide against African Indian people. The British Empire systematically provoked famine in the Indian territories, believing that this would naturally suppress the liberation movement. They also unleashed genocide against the indigenous population of Tasmania and Australia, which, according to some estimates, resulted in the death of up to 90% of the natives of these territories. Faced with the lawsuits by veterans of Kenya's anti-colonial Mau Mau uprising, which took place in 1955 to 63, which were imprisoned and brutally tortured by the British military, London started a deliberate process of destruction of records in order to obscure the extent of other crimes committed by the British Empire. Britain was fully guided by the principle of divide and conquer in relation to its colonies, pitting people against each other and playing on contradictions of religious and ethnic groups. The artificial borders drawn by the British along the lines of contradiction laid the foundation for the vast majority of today's territorial disputes and religious ethnic conflicts in Africa, Middle East and Southeast Asia. The most illustrative example is the partition of British India in 1947 into two independent states, India and Pakistan, which provoked cruel clashes between Hindus and Muslims, huge flows of refugees and famine, which killed about 1 million civilians and made 18 million people refugees. Nearly 4 million went missing. Right now there are several billion people in the world, but that was back in 1947. Can you imagine the scale of these events? Can you compare these figures to the general population figures? It's simply incompatible. If we translate this into today's numbers, I dread to even try to imagine. Given the indecisiveness of the border, the relations between India and Pakistan remain tense to this day. The British do not even try very hard to conceal their blatantly racist attitudes of the colonial era. They just say, it is what it is. The colonial period is still largely a factor of national pride for the British society. A specific system of values, the ideology of mission and the white man's burden, supposedly the source of progress for the entire world, is firmly entrenched. And the fact that this progress brings suffering to hundreds of millions of people, the fact that progress is not necessarily good. Progress is good when its purpose is right, when its purpose is pure, when the intentions are pure. There is also such thing as a disease progress, and diseases can progress as well. One cannot even call it mistakes. These are crimes, but they are not going to repent or compensate anyone for their mistakes. London's approach to the uncivilized world is particularly evident in Ukraine. It is indicative what Daily Telegraph, a pro-government media outlet, writes about the Ukrainians. On the 26th of February 2022, the British wrote something about Ukrainians. Listen carefully, this is very important. It's an official media outlet which is responsible for their words. It's not a blog, it's not an opinion piece. It is Daily Telegraph. And here I quote, "They look like us, and that is shocking. Ukraine is a European country. Its people watch Netflix and have Instagram accounts. They vote in elections. They have a free press." End of quote. Can you imagine that? An independent country. Well, it is influenced by the West and has been destroyed since 1990s, but actually, even before, when Ukraine was part of the Soviet Union, science and industry were developed there. Factories and planes were built there. They had industry and their own culture. World-known people came from there. They did not identify as purely Russian or Ukrainian. They said they were influenced by both cultures, and they wrote in Russia, drawing inspiration from Ukrainian culture as well. And here we see the century is 21, and London calls Ukrainians people who look like us. A shocking discovery, worthy of a modern Columbus. There live people who know how to use social media and look like us. Imagine that. It's quite terrifying, actually. This is what we are fighting against. Nevertheless, the bloodshed and crimes of the Kiev regime that receives a lot of support from Britain, and their crimes against the inhabitants of the Donbas do not deserve any kind of mention in this media outlet or in other British press. We are confident that the materials we publish on our website will be of interest in order to understand what kind of ideology we are dealing with, who is behind this, those in the West, who supports such unhealthy things as the Kiev regime. In order to understand the historical context, it would be very useful to take a look at the materials that we are going to publish on, that we have published on our website, and we are going to provide you a link in the text of the briefing. It would be also interesting to compare historical facts, and I'm not even speaking about ancient history, I'm speaking about modern history as well. It would be interesting to compare history and statements about freedom, democracy, protection of the rights, and so on. The conclusions are up to you, but I would like to sum it up as follows. The people who have not repented for the horrors they have done have no moral ground to speak about anything. Another announcement: on May the 24th, 25th, Moscow will hold the second Eurasian Economic Forum, which is timed to coincide with the meeting of the Supreme Eurasian Economic Council. The topic of the forum is Eurasian integration in a multipolar world, and it will include about 35 expert sessions on the most topical issues of the Eurasian Economic Union, EAEU, including energy, food security, digital security, deepening economic cooperation, scientific and technical cooperation, prospects of the tourism industry. Heads of member states of the EAEU, observers, and invited countries will speak at the plenary. On the sidelines of the forum, the international climatic contest Green Eurasia will be held, along with the breakfast of the Russian Agency for Strategic Initiatives and a number of other events. We expect a lot of speakers and participants. Program and the details for registration for the forum will be available on the official website, and we will give you a link. The information about the topics of the forum is published on the social media of the Eurasian Economic Commission and the Telegram channel talking about EAEU of the Specialized Department of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Russia. We'll give you all the necessary links. And another announcement: the Foreign Ministry's main administration for service to the diplomatic corps, GlavUPDK, is holding the second national creative contest, Architecture of Diplomacy, for young artists aged 18 to 35. Last year, 16 paintings were submitted by artists from various regions of the country, from Donetsk to Irkutsk. The 2022 contest showed that Russian culture cannot be cancelled, and artistic youth need our support more than ever. With 2023 designated as the Year of Music and the 150th anniversary of Sergei Rachmaninoff, the theme of the contest is Architecture as Music Suspended in Stone. Young artists are invited to draw parallels between the musical works of Russian composers and the mansions that are under the jurisdiction of the GlavUPDK. The contest is intended to introduce a broad audience to the creative potential of young Russian artists, to attract public attention to historical and cultural aspects of our country's diplomatic service. Contestants can be professional and amateur artists, students of secondary, vocational and tertiary educational institutions from any year of study, students of colleges and other creative classes in schools. Winners will be announced after September the 1st. Works should be submitted between June the 15th and August the 1st. To participate, you will need to submit an electronic application between May the 1st and June the 15th. I am ready to answer your questions. Do you have international life with us?
Hello. The U.S. State Secretary Antony Blinken said that the American authorities leave it up to Kiev the methods of protection of their own territory. The quote, "We leave it to Ukraine to decide how it's going to defend itself and how it's going to try to get back the territory that's been seized from it illegally by Russia over the past 14 months and going back to 2014. This is a direct quote from Mr. Blinken. What do you think? Is this claim an attempt from the USA to take off their blame of the subsequent situation in Ukraine? First of all, I would like to say that if we pose the question this way, and I don't mean you, but I mean Mr. Blinken, that I think we could also say that we leave it to ourselves the right to decide how we protect ourselves and how we bring about our personal interests and our foreign policy, we can incorporate international cooperation. We can use these phrases. We perfectly understand that every sovereign country has its right to realize their personal interests, but we're also aiming for the respect of international law, which had been built over the years and which is based on the UN Charter and the whole UN system with all its subsequent institutions. So we will not speak in loud speeches. I don't think it brings any results. I've mentioned several historic examples today, from the Yugoslavia bombardment to current situation around Ukraine. We're talking with this loud phrases by the Western authorities has unfortunately led to bloody consequences. It's long overdue for them to draw conclusions, but when we speak of responsibility, there is no such thing for them. They're deprived of any blame because of the consequences. And I will explain why. Today we talk a lot about history, about historic memory, about facts that took place. And we see how they cancel them, how they rewrite them, how they present them differently. And this is because the matter of responsibility, of historic memory, of the truth are interconnected. If there is no historic memory, there is no responsibility. These are politicians or people with political amnesia. They have a very perfect approach for themselves. They did it, then they forgot about it, so there is no responsibility for these actions. So the wording of this subject as possible responsibility or trying to step away from this responsibility is out of the question, because there is no such category for them. They free themselves of any responsibility because they have no historic facts. And as you can see, you don't have to take my word for it, you can see it for yourself. These people are poorly educated. Of course, you can know about past historic events by self-development, by gaining experience, by stories shared in your family, or through quality education. Of course, there's the television, mass media. Television and mass media are blocked by them. Self-development, you understand, is also out of the question. Historic roots don't go back to justice. And as for education, it's either poorly or it's too centered around ideology. Thank you very much. But I agree with you that this has to be considered in the context of instigation of the Kiev regime to commit these crimes. So on the contrary, they support this. And I try not to use this word, but I understand that these are soulless creatures. Or as Gogol wrote, these are dead souls. So this is an instigation and which proves wishes to push the Kiev regime to commit even more atrocious crimes. And for me, I want to speak honestly that year-long actions of leading the website and the ideology of Nazism and directed against humans and Ukrainian mass media that support the authorities, that has no criticism or backlash from the West. And there is no information of whoever wrote it. No. The information instigating to commit crimes against public figures, against journalists, and that is considered to be normal by Kiev regime and by the West. Moving on. Is Izvestia with us today? Yes, we're here. Hello. Anton Zaltnitsky. Madam Zakharova. We have the following question. Could you please mention how much stronger, in light of recent events and attempts to isolate Russia, is the rapprochement of Russia with India and other BRICS countries? And what steps should we expect? I would say that the partnership in BRICS format is picking up pace. We have a solid base. We have food security strategy, digital economy partnership, agreement, trade and investment initiatives for sustainable development, supply chain cooperation initiatives. And after 2022, combined GDP of BRICS countries was higher than that of G7. Say, as they try to blow out the narrative, or there's ritual actions. But the real input of real economics in the world economics, and these achievements are supported by mutual interest in building a mutually beneficial dialogue and building a new, more equitable global political and financial economic architecture, leaning towards true multipolarity and supporting interests of most countries in the world. As for our contact with BRICS countries, we will include it in our briefing text, our materials. As for our cooperation with Brazil, India, China, and of course with CAR, there will be figures and all kinds of information which I think will be useful. Thank you very much. Thank you. Is the Portal Newsroom with us today? Hello, Madam Zakharova. Armenian Prime Minister Mr. Pashinyan claimed that the CSTO was unable to fulfill its obligations regarding Armenia. How would Moscow comment on the words of Armenian Prime Minister? We have made numerous comments on this. If you need me to reiterate those words, I will repeat our position from the government, from the Russian MFA. We think that Armenia's criticism is counterproductive. We think it's unwise to discuss the effectiveness of organizations outside that organizations. There are different formats and channels of information, and the participants of that organization and of that structure who are not only ready to hear them out, but also work in that direction. And of course, we heard the estimations that were voiced on May 4th in Prague by the European Union mission, in Armenia. Prime Minister of the Armenia noted that the decision to invite people from the European Union wasn't easy because it doesn't guarantee security and can create challenges. It begs the question, perhaps high expectations from the European Union and CSTO don't take into account the reality. In a way, we expect initiative steps from our Armenian partners to renew the work of the CSTO mission in Armenia and other measures to help our ally. And Yerevan knows that. Our second question, Baku and Yerevan have made tangible progress on a durable peace agreement, said the U.S. State Secretary Antony Blinken, following meetings. And Yerevan knows that. Our second question, Baku and Yerevan have made tangible progress on a durable peace agreement, said the U.S. State Secretary Antony Blinken, following meetings between the ministers expected to take place in Moscow. Will Moscow take into account the agreements reached in Washington between the ministers when it comes to signing the peace agreement? These statements made by Antony Blinken, as you mentioned, about tangible progress go against Azerbaijan's and Armenia's commentaries when it comes to peace agreements, because some disagreements have been pointed out on many points. We take into account that following work will take place on a bilateral basis. We consider our role in easing that process, and we've offered Moscow as a platform for the next stage in the negotiations. Our main goal is to make sure there is a durable peace in that region. And the only way to achieve that is by delivering on all the previously reached agreements by Russia's, Azerbaijan's, and Armenian leaders. The West have been discussing more and more Russian ghost ships and their alleged attempts to compile a map of terrestrial and submarine objects of critical European infrastructure. NATO Assistant Secretary General for Intelligence and Secretary David Kattler warned that in Atlantic's North and Baltic Sea there could be subversive actions with submarine internet cables. How could you comment on that? You know, these words are perfect for the supernatural programs that study the unknown area of our lives, who take into account any testimonials by people, Flying Dutchmen, the Loch Ness monsters, or aliens. So the ghost ships are made for that. There are whole TV channels dedicated to that. There are books, there are magazines. Our work is more towards tangible facts, and if there are those facts, we comment on it, and if there aren't, we have nothing to say. If there is something unconfirmed, but that was previously expressed by officials through their position, then we're ready to work with that. But serious discussions on ghost ships, as was mentioned by the NATO officials, that's not a question for us. I think they better answer the questions that have been piling up over the last months. Who is responsible and what happened? Who committed the terrorist acts against Nord Stream 2? We have all the possibilities to find the truth under the international investigation. It would be perfect if it happened under the UN Secretary General, but if they blocked that, then at least by conducting an investigation and allowing any involved countries to take place, and by involved countries we mean the countries whose infrastructure was involved, and then we won't have to talk about ghost ships. We will analyze tangible facts that will come up during that investigation. Madam Zakharova, another question. Georgian president said that the cancellation of the visa regime between Georgia and Russia is unacceptable and recommencing of direct flights, and it's an attempt to attack Russia. What would you say about that? First of all, we have published an extensive commentary on that today. And other than that, we made steps ourselves, which we have full right to do. We've spoken about our decisions, how we will realize that. We've made our task clear, and we've explained our reasons. And the rest will be decided based on our steps and decisions. Thank you. Moving on. Is the Chinese Media Corporation with us today? Yes? Hello, we have 3 questions. China has presented a report with the cyber attacks cases that were conducted by the CIA over the 10 years towards China. And according to that document, large transnational internet companies from the USA were interfering in the internal politics of other countries, in the countries where the actions went against the interests of the USA. How would you comment on that? We took a close look at the Chinese report, the Empire of Hackers, and they spoke about using the informational technologies to interfere with internal affairs of countries. And we welcome the efforts of Beijing to unveil the criminal foreign policy of Washington. We're well aware of the methods and instruments described in that document of American special service in the digital space. We've also spoken at length about it at our briefings, in international platforms, about colorful revolutions, about protests using internet messengers and internet, about electronic surveillance and capture of data. And of course, there have been a lot of reports, but a clear example, the US have been using spy programs such as Pegasus and Graphite to gain illegal access to mobile devices and interfere with informational systems all over the world. And it's very important that Chinese colleagues have pointed out the role of American IT corporations who have been in close contact with intelligence in the US. We know how Microsoft leaves blank spaces in their products used abroad, and then they're later used by CIA. We know how Google and Meta use censor when it comes to actions by the administration of Joe Biden. And of course, the involvement of Ukrainian hackers. We agree with the conclusions made by the authors of that document about the nature of American democracy and this rule-based order. And against the backdrop of those revelations of Washington's actions on the international field, especially cynic, are constant words from the U.S. representatives on respecting human rights, on respecting independent countries' sovereignty. And if we look at mass media all over the world, they can also take control of human minds. And the further we go, the further the truth is interpolated by these sources. There are, of course, lying accusations of Washington towards Russia and China about hackers against the American infrastructure. And as I've already mentioned today, the movie that was prepared by so-called journalists of the North European countries about spy action from Russian diplomats in that region. It begs the question, do Denmark, Norway, Sweden, and Finland, do they have intelligence service? It's a direct question, it's very simple. I know they do. And I don't know it out of some private information. It is revealed in the information published by those countries. They have educational institutions that prepare those people. They have intelligence, counterintelligence. They have budget directed towards that field. So a very direct question, these people work somewhere abroad, all these people. Why don't they reveal in what countries these people are working? And then we will reach a more harmonious place. Then they will stop talking about what they see in Russian diplomats, and their countries will talk about their achievements, in which countries they have representatives of intelligence, of legal or legal intelligence. And then we will see. And closer to this subject, once again, it begs the question, do the United States not have hackers at all? Have they disappeared? Have they been poisoned? What could have happened that they no longer have hackers, or for what reason they keep using the same words that they have come up with, that hackers are always from Russia, China, Korean Republic, or Iran, so other countries don't have that problem?
Another example is topping. Do they believe that it only exists in Russia or in other countries where sport and athletes are competitive? That's a similar example. You have to understand that the United States has embarked directly on the line of the militarization of ICTs, and they intend to use them for offensive purposes against other states. In contrast, we and our Chinese partners are promoting a peaceful agenda in the digital environmental space and advocating a fair system of international information security. It should be noted that Russia and China signed in 2015 an agreement on cooperation in international information security. At international platforms, our countries promote the development of new norms of responsible behavior of states in cyberspace. We are confident that the Russian concept of the Convention on International Information Security and the Chinese Global Data Security Initiative will make a significant contribution to this. This was once again confirmed in the joint statement of the leaders following the visit of the President of the People's Republic of China to Russia in March this year. We are jointly promoting these guidelines at the UN, first of all, through the implementation of the idea of a universal international legal instrument that would help prevent the use of information and communication technologies for political military purposes, strengthen confidence-building measures, and close the digital divide between Western and developing countries. Thank you very much. One more question. NATO is about to open an office in Tokyo, the first of its kind in Asia. Its mission is to hold periodic consultations with allies in this region. It is reported in the Japanese media, citing high-level sources in the country's government and in NATO. How would you comment on these plans? NATO's intention to open its office in the Japanese capital is yet another evidence of the alliance global ambitions and plans to entrench itself thoroughly in the Asia-Pacific region in order to breed NATO-centric formats of anti-Russian and anti-Chinese charge. We are convinced that the advance of the North Atlantic bloc in Asia will lead to its militarization and the strengthening of bloc confrontation. Regional security issues must be dealt with the countries of the region. We have always highlighted that Asia has been very successful in ensuring real security needs, not other way around as it happened in Europe, where fake issues allegedly related to security began to dominate over cooperation and turned it into the area of illegal dominance of ones over the others, which undermines the basis of market relations and competition. And the Western countries are not okay with these achievements of the region, and they started provocating the situation around the Korean Peninsula. They will continue doing this. And regional security issues must be dealt by the countries of the region on the basis of existing inclusive infrastructure without involving external actors who only bring in a confrontational agenda, provoke aggravation of the political military situation, and create new dividing lines. We have repeatedly drawn Japan's attention, including through diplomatic channels, to the fact that the involvement of extra-regional NATO member states in maritime exercises in the Pacific and other military activities in the region leads to increased tension and undermines security in the Asia-Pacific region. But what is even more important is the following. Does the United States have the experience of contributing to the security through some real practical achievements? Have they achieved something through mediation? They have provided mediation services several times. Have they managed to bring closer the stances of the north and the south of the Korean Peninsula? Have they been able to normalize the relations between major actors in this region? Are there any tangible examples as to how the United States has resolved existing difficult issues in the context of the relations between Beijing and Taipei? And we constantly proceed from the premises of the United China, but we see Washington doing the contrary and aggravating these differences and adding fuel to the fire. In my opinion, they just contributing to the increase of confrontation in all the areas, in politics, in the information area, in civil society. Where is the experience that can be demonstrated as an achievement which gives Washington the moral ground to give guidelines to others and to increase its presence in this very serious area of security in other parts of the world. There are no such examples. We have just mentioned Asia, but speaking about the Pacific region, in general, there are no other examples of the kind. What about the Middle East? Are there any examples of the British? We have talked about Africa in the context of different American experiments and about Asia as well. So we don't see any examples that give Washington the moral ground to work in these challenging developing regions where there already have been attempts by West to take everything under control, which led to a failure of the British and Americans. There are no such examples. So I've given you a detailed answer. It's important to highlight it all. Thank you very much. One more question. On the 3rd of May this year, U.S. authorities once again warned of a possible default if Democrats and Republicans do not agree to raise the national debt ceiling. A default could lead to a financial crisis in the country and cause a crisis of confidence in the U.S. dollar. Shai Akabas, an analyst of the Bipartisan Policy Center in the U.S., notes that the United States once again faces a risk of defaulting on its debt within weeks or months. This is disproportionate to a country that is seen as a ballast to the financial system and will only add uncertainty to the shaky economy. Does this mean that the so-called ballast country has already become a major problem, threatening the stability in the world economy? We believe that this question is to be divided into several parts. First of all, these ritual dances that are performed by the American Ministry of Finances and by Biden's administrations represent attempts to draw attention, but are not really the main factor that we need to take into account assessing the state of the American economy. Another thing is that there is a special site which shows the growth of the U.S. state debt, and it works out the debt every year. For example, it can calculate the debt accumulated by an important event. Moreover, on the website, you can witness how the U.S. debt grows every minute by $2 million. So that's a real index that you can take into account. So you can watch this dance performance, or you can take a look at real figures and a real calculator that shows you the growth of the debt. That's a real indicator. The approaching moment when default on U.S. obligations is looming and the U.S. Treasury runs out of options to finance deficit with extraordinary maneuvers, as they say, which according to Janet Yellen could happen as soon as June the 1st, is always used by the opponents of the current administration in their internal political struggle. That's a ritual that they use. It's like a Groundhog Day. There are things that are happening permanently, constantly, like this default discussion. Such situations have happened many times before and invariably ended up in the same way. Another increase in the U.S. debt ceiling, which already stands at an astronomical $31.4 trillion US. Now, once again, they will perform some ritual actions, and with the partisan bickering in the United States, it's highly likely that a dramatic spectacle in the best Hollywood tradition will be upon us when the debt limit deal is struck just a minute or a few seconds before the hour of fix, as in fact America loves to do. With all the drama, with all the breaking news notes, all the emotions. After all, this is an internal U.S. affair. If they like doing so, that's their own business. But there is an important detail. This monetary policy of the U.S. in the form of uncontrolled dollar emission to keep business activity afloat and the constant buildup of the debt burden has already led to a runaway inflation in America and in global markets, and undermined the U.S. financial and banking system, increased risks to the stability of the global economy, and in general, it's very irresponsible. All these actions, coupled with the illegal unilateral measures of the U.S. against economic operators, undesirable governments and countries, undermine confidence in the dollar as a reserve currency and an instrument of reserve accumulation. And since they have been imposing on everyone this currency, claiming it to be reliable, It all affects the world economy. The countries of the global majority are well aware of the risk of devaluation of their investments in dollar assets because of the domestic political squabbles in Washington. According to statistics, total foreign investment in U.S. bonds has fallen by more than $300 billion since February 28th this year alone. Many nations are switching to non-dollar settlements and mutual trade. The State Department and the White House have been talking about it, as well as their opponents. They admit that they have problems with currency, and the problems have been created by themselves. If they hadn't started using dollar as an instrument of achieving their goals, that wouldn't have happened. Many nations have abandoned the global financial architecture controlled by the U.S. and its satellites due to these reasons. Reality shows that the ability of the U.S. economy to continue to live on debt is shrinking considerably once again. We are not even analyzing the indexes, but the figures are evident. The country lives on debt, and the debt is not covered by GPD. Every country has debt, but it should be covered. It should be less than the GDP produced in the country, but it surpasses many times the GPD index. So God knows what will happen, especially if the system is based on uncontrolled emission of the currency. And the decisions are made by politics and some consultations with economists, but they are made as political decisions. These are real figures. And obviously, it's not certain whether the American citizens are well aware of the problem. Perhaps being inside this information vacuum, they don't even understand what state their economy is. And of course, they are not informed by this. They are threatened by China and Russia, but no one is telling them about the real state of their economy. They are just being told that the American economy is the best in the world, and the state debt is just a nice figure. Do you have any more questions? No? Let's go on. Do we have Golos Отечества with us? Yes, Maria Vladimirovna. Hello. I have the following question. Every year on the 27th of April since 2014, the Netherlands celebrates one of the main holidays of the state, King's Day. This year, on the 27th of April, the embassy of the Netherlands gathered representatives, diplomats, and ambassadors from various NATO countries to celebrate this day. Among them was the U.S. ambassador to Russia. The celebration was overshadowed by the presence of Russian public organizations outside the walls of the embassy of the Netherlands. Activists orchestrated events, and they cried, "Fascism will not pass, Ukraine is our land, NATO get out of the USSR." Were there any claims or conversations about this at the diplomatic level from the Netherlands or other missions? First of all, I'd like to say that our country observes its obligations under the Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations and ensures the protection of diplomatic missions and their staff, irrespective of which country we are talking about. We have obligations. We are committed to that, and it is applied to the embassy of Netherlands in our country. This is the first thing. Secondly, this meeting or event that you have mentioned, I'm not going to classify it. As far as I know, and I have proofs, was orchestrated and organized in accordance with our legislation. So a request to conduct it had been submitted, and it was implemented in accordance with Article 29 of the Constitution of the Russian Federation, and the actions were agreed upon with the local authorities. As for the specific data such as time, the place, you can address the local authorities for additional information. At the same time, I would like to note that our embassy in The Hague and our diplomats throughout the current year have become an object of threats and violations of rights. For example, an explosive device was thrown at the embassy, and luckily it didn't go off. A criminal case was instigated near the embassy. There are anti-Russian manifestations almost every day, during which Ukrainian symbols are demonstrated, and there are threats. And the Netherlands authorities do not want to participate in the investigation. They have just stopped all the investigations since they don't have any tangible proof, as they say.
One can dwell on that topic for hours on end. These are specific offenders, a boring thing to concern oneself with. The examples of when incendiary device includes video footage. Our ambassador received threats from a specific user of the social media. We have passed on this information to the country of stay, but the Dutch authorities decided it was not enough and simply ended the investigation. Last but not least, I would like to say that we remain in constant contact with the Dutch embassy here in Moscow. If they have any questions or concerns, they can always speak to us on any issues that they may have. At the same time, we expect reciprocity when it comes to the life of our diplomats in The Hague. Thank you. Do have the Moscow Post here with us. We have 3 questions today. But first, I would like to congratulate everyone on the holidays. Number 1, the US reaction to the attempted drone attack on the Kremlin has been interesting, especially given that the US and Russia have a history of bilateral contacts on strategic stability. What can you say about that? If a drone attack is not a reason to compare notes on security, what should be considered the subject of urgent consultations? We have already spoken about that. We have a number of bilateral channels of communication with the United States that are intended for discussion of sensitive issues among experts, professionals, specialized experts. Regrettably, the United States uses these channels rarely, if at all. They prefer megaphone diplomacy. They just take up the podium and no professional discussion that we are always ready to hold when we used dialogue tools that involved the opportunity for making practical decisions and finding practical solutions. Apparently, the Americans were not happy with this idea. It's up to them, though. My second point is, speaking of the situation you're asking your question about, here it's not about expert-level consultations, but rather about their narrative and their intention, their policy of delivering a strategic blow to Russia, defeating Russia on the battlefield. What kind of consultations can be possible if they openly and directly claim their intention to support the Kiev regime in any and all of its endeavors? And when we say, what about the murders and terrorist attacks? They said, don't ask us about that. And they did not express any negative reaction to these situations. They express full solidarity with everything the Kiev regime does. They've been building up this situation for many years, and they have been providing Ukraine with weapons and funds. What kind of consultations can we speak about if this is their conscious position that they've been cultivating for many years? I believe it was a prank, but George W. Bush was the one who said that the Kiev regime's goal is to kill as many Russians as possible. What kind of consultations can be possible? Ex-president of the United States, son of another ex-president of the United States, the flesh and blood of America, of America's military industry and political elite, and part of the expert elite who speaks at political and expert level platforms. And he was the one who said Kiev regime's goal was to kill as many Russians as possible. It wasn't just his private opinion. He was speaking about his conceptual views. However, in officials' statements, these gets some kind of veneer of respectability when they speak about strategic defeat. Second question, is the United Nations Security Council expected to convene to discuss the attempted drone attack on the Kremlin? Please also think back to the terrorist attack against Russian citizens. I'm not even speaking about the hostilities, because they are ongoing and have been ongoing for a long time, and civilians die there as well. But I really want you to remember other events. There has been another terrorist attack which killed a Russian citizen and injured another one. These people were chosen as Kiev regime's targets many years ago. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't an expression of the beastly nature of the Kiev regime. It was a murder with terrorist means. So please remember that as well. And we are going to draw the United Nations Security Council's attention during official meetings, Security Council consultations to Kiev regime's terrorist activities constantly. This is a topic that has been and continues to be very much in the center of our work at the United Nations, both as part of our diplomatic activities and in our information work. Last question. Josep Borrell, the head of the European Union's Foreign Policy Service, expects the EU Council to promptly approve the draft of sanctions mechanisms against any country suspected of corruption. What can the MFA's legal experts say about that? Well, apparently he draws certain parallels with the allegations against Ursula von der Leyen. Perhaps he is trying to oust her from office because Madame von der Leyen is suspected of corruption amounting to 9 billion euro with the procurements of American vaccines for the EU market, which provoked a lot of issues and one can even say shock when the pandemic was ravaging the continent. Why were the American producers chosen? Why was it a specific company? And why so much? Then they learned that she had private personal contacts with the head of that American company. She spoke to that head about something and agreed to sign this 9 billion euro contract. And there is a controversy about the quality of those vaccines as well. The investigation is ongoing. Well, they would be better placed to speak about that, but the corruption allegations are very much in the center of this situation. Perhaps Mr. Borrell meant Madame von der Leyen at the moment. And they have adopted many controversial decisions over the years, and I was flabbergasted to see how the EU-NATO brainstorm adopted restrictions and threats of restrictions against those who will infringe on Moldova's sovereignty. What about Romania? Has no one considered that when this decision was adopted? and current Moldovan regime is affiliated with Romania very closely, and they systemically work to curb Moldova's sovereignty from within. So here we see a hybrid form of interference in the internal affairs of that country to curb Moldova's rights as a sovereign state. And I believe that this product of EU's think tanks' endeavors, which resulted in document about restrictions, are the same people who wanted to rename the Moldovan language Romanian language. Those were the people who were trying to prove that Kiev has the right to support Ukrainian and only Ukrainian in their territory, because according to them, language is a pillar of sovereignty, and the sovereign state of Ukraine has the right to their sovereign right to language policy and should develop Ukrainian language only. Who cares that so many people spoke Russian and did not speak any other languages and have been doing so historically, even back in the day of the Soviet Union? The heart of their argumentation was the matter of sovereignty. Well, it's a two-way street, so if you change the language, if you change Moldovan into Romanian, it's about abandoning your sovereignty. And no logic underpins this decision. Moldovan language is older than Romania, given that even though they are similar, and it was mentioned before the Romanian language. Bizarre controversies. We are for the non-intrusive, inclusive and technical cooperation in the anti-corruption sphere on the principle of equal rights and mutual consideration of national interests. We resolutely condemn the persistent attempts by Western countries to politicize cooperation in this area. Here we see specific examples of politizations taken to the extreme. This is the kind of story when they invent tools to fight someone else that will fire back at themselves. Because this approach does not only hinder effective joint work, but also destroys the mechanisms that have been created over the year, including the UN Convention Against Corruption. By the way, this year marks the 20th anniversary of the opening for the signing of this document. We regret to know that broad consensus and desire for broad practical cooperation based on trust is now undermined by the persistent desire of individual countries to impose rules and politically motivated solutions. Josep Borrell's proposal to impose an EU sanctions regime on individuals and legal entities of foreign countries involved in serious corruption crimes. I am just waiting to see the Kiev regime on this list, because half of its officials are sure to wind up on this list. Excuse me, but it's not just about discussions. Here we are speaking about some practical solutions. When are we going to see the Kiev regime's oligarchs on those lists? Are we or are we not? The issue has long been overdue. The alleged grounds for repressive measures, including the impact of a systemic or large-scale corruption in third countries on the fundamental values and interests of the EU, or the achievement of the objectives of the common foreign and security policy, including support for democracy and the rule of law in other states, would seem to allow not only to arbitrarily approach the selection of subjects on sanctions lists, but also gives them free rein to interpret the existing international law. Does this corruption threaten the EU values? It does. Well, that's bad corruption. Sanctions, stop lists, sanctions list. If it doesn't, or even promotes EU values and NATO values, this is the good corruption. You probably remember the famous words, "He may be a son of a bitch, but he is our son of a bitch." Well, this is corruption, but this is our corruption. So everything is fine and okay. No need to worry about that. And if this corruption hurts us, restrictions are sure to follow. It is yet another example of political influence, and it has nothing to do with real mechanisms to punish criminals recognized as such according to the law. Thank you. Do we have Embassy Live here with us today? Good afternoon, Madam Zakharova. Apparently we are going to set a new record today. 2 questions. You have already spoken about the scandal in Ankara. Partly, I think I've told you all about it. Yes, I agree. However, I'd like to clarify something. Are we to expect attacks against Russian delegations at other diplomatic events? Should we expect? I have already said it has been going on for many years. I've given you specific examples. I can give you the example of my colleague who went to the UNGA Committee on Information about 5 years ago. And as part of the committee's work, representatives of various countries, dozens of countries, discussed the information agenda. During the committee's meeting and sidelines events, he was literally attacked. He was chased around in the corridors by the Kiev regime representatives wearing army green and khaki. I wonder why. Well, the why is clear, because these are the same cutthroat thugs. Perhaps you hadn't joined our briefing when I was telling you that. We have requested, with an official note, the UN Secretariat to identify the perpetrators, who allowed them to enter the building, what their status was, and to adopt relevant measures to prevent this situation from happening again, to sanction this delegation, because it was about a direct threat against our employees' life. It wasn't merely dangerous to chase around the UN corridors. They threatened his life. They threatened to murder him. The UN Secretariat did not respond anything for a long time, but later they responded to our notes. I can't remember whether it was an oral or written response, but they said it was inadmissible, measures had been taken, and the Ukrainian permanent mission to the UN was accordingly admonished. The Secretariat also said to the Ukrainian mission they were not allowed to behave that way, but apparently that's the only way they can behave. If the regime's leadership takes steps that can be qualified as terrorism and extremism, what can be expected from the rank and file? This regime came to power as a result of an anti-constitutional coup, not with any legitimate methods. How can one expect the regime that came to power using such means to observe law, to respect law? They were once proved right that you can get what you want by breaking the law. This is why we started the special military operation, because these people were out of law, both inside their country, it was their internal matter though, but they also started to spill their illegal activities over to other countries. They became a springboard, and given that no laws or respect for law could be seen in the country, one could easily see where this was going. Do you have any more questions? Apparently not. I would like to clarify. Embassy Life, do you have any other questions? In that case, I say goodbye to you. All right? If there are no more questions, this is goodbye. I believe Moscow Post said it had 2 questions. All right. Perhaps they got disconnected if I failed to reply to some of your questions. You answered to all of our questions. I believe it was... Please remind me, what was it? The Embassy Live. If I failed to answer some of your questions, please send them to us in writing and we'll give you a prompt answer. Thank you for your attention. See you next time. Take care.